was 6 years old. I almost drowned in a hotel swimming pool. I remember it very. The longest 3 seconds of my life were when I was 14 and I was in an automobile wreck. I was a passenger in an automobile wreck, and I saw the car coming. I think that if anyone looks back to their own childhood and tries to think of even one honest child, did I have one honest friend? I think the answer is no. That's the way it feels, actually, when you're about to drown. And the next thing I remember is that someone pulled me out of the water, this just absolute stranger I never saw again, and I'm just lying on the pavement by the pool.
In 1992, an unknown writer burst onto the bestseller list with a ritualistic murder story set amongst a group of classics students in a New England college. With its potboiler plot and complex structure dense with literary allusion, it was an original and winning formula, bringing fame and fortune to its reclusive 28-year-old author, Donna Tartt. But following this remarkable debut, silence. Now, 10 years after The Secret History, she is back. The Little Friend is set a world away from its predecessor. It's a child's eye view of the American South, but the mixture of psychological suspense, dazzling erudition, and rich descriptive passages remains the same.
Now, what was the genesis of The Little Friend?
Well, I began writing The Little Friend when I was working on the end of The Secret History and had really finished the heavy labor of composition and was freed up to start really working in a serious way on something else. But it's very funny because what stays in my mind 10 years later is the finishing details of The Secret History are very, very clearly etched in my mind, and they've somehow erased a little bit the exact idea that I had for The Little Friend. It's hard for me to remember. I wish I had a better answer for that.
Much has been made of the fact that it's 10 years since The Secret History, and shock horror, it's taken 10 years for this book to come out. But tell me, does that chime uneasily with you, or it's a natural thing for you to be spending as much time as you need in a novel and not worry about when it's going to be published?
Shock horror would chime with me if I thought I had to turn out a book every 2 years. It's very interesting because I spent 10 years on The Secret History, and then when I finished it, there was an expectation that another book should be out within 2 or 3 years, and people were just talking to me as if this were the case, and it was just a natural assumption, and this was the way that things were going to be from now on. And I just thought, hang on a minute. I mean, these aren't the rules that I want to play by. I don't want to do it this way. Why hurry out another novel when, thank God, the success of The Secret History really gave me the time to do something completely different, something that I wanted to do that was completely different in terms of craft and gave me a much broader grasp of technical problems. I mean, I feel like I've put out another branch as a writer, that I've done something that I really haven't done before, and I'm incredibly fortunate that I had the time to do that. This was like writing another first novel.
That first novel, The Secret History, used a structure borrowed from the Greek classics to redefine the thriller genre.
I was interested in how classical idioms and motifs and classical ways of doing things could be translated to a modern audience. Some things transfer very well, which is why you see it used so often in Hollywood. Think of the beginning of Sunset Boulevard with Joe Gillis floating in the pool, and then everything is the back story.
The snow in the mountains was melting, and Bunny had been dead for several weeks before we came to understand the gravity of our situation. He'd been dead for 10 days before they found him, It was one of the biggest manhunts in Vermont history. State troopers, the FBI, even an Army helicopter. It is difficult to believe that such an uproar took place over an act for which I was partially responsible. Even more difficult to believe I could have walked through it. The cameras, the uniforms, the black crowd sprinkled over Mount Cataract like ants in a sugar bowl, without incurring a blink of suspicion. But walking through it all was one thing. Walking away, unfortunately, has proved to be quite another.
The Secret History, you said it was really, the thought was the Iliad, the thought for the structure was the Iliad. Is that still how you feel about it?
I think I was talking about starting it in medias res and, you know, telling what was going to happen in the first 6 lines. And in that respect, it was. But what I was really thinking about was the Bacchae by Euripides. Pentheus is very against the idea of these Dionysian festivals and being out of control, and he's very controlled himself, and how dare they do this. And then Dionysus himself comes to see him. Pentheus doesn't recognize him, and before long he doesn't quite know how it happens, but you know, he's got a thyrsus, he's wearing ivy around his brow, and he goes to his death. And it's a terrible phenomenon of human nature that we often do become the things we hate. We do often become what we fear the most.
The male narrator of The Secret History, Richard Papin, joins a brilliant but incestuous clique of college students and is, at first unwittingly, drawn into a set of violent murders inspired by ancient Greek rituals.
Henry, what in God's name have you done? He smiled. You tell me, he said. And the horrible thing was, somehow, that I did know. You killed somebody, I said, didn't you? He looked at me for a moment, and then to my utter surprise, he leaned back in his chair and laughed. Good for you, he said.
I actually am with Hitchcock in thinking that offstage violence is much more effective than what we actually see.
Hitchcock said that the way to create suspense is to have 2 people sitting at a table talking, a bomb ticking under the table, the 2 people completely oblivious of the bomb, but the audience sees it. The audience knows it's there. That's how to create suspense. And that was what I was working on in this book, and that's what I was trying to do. Because from the instant you meet the character Bunny, you know he's a dead man.
The classmates in The Secret History, in a sense, are not created as particularly likable people.
No, I don't think it's important for novels to have likable people.
But what happens is you absolutely stick with them, and they become very compelling characters. And it's a clever thing to be able to do, to have characters which you perhaps don't really like or don't find to have any redeeming features, but you're so attached to them.
Well, I think that's very much a feature of real life, isn't it? I mean, characters that we don't like at all, we don't particularly attached to, but we're quite interested in what happens to them. I think that's just very much a feature of human nature. When I'm working on fiction, I don't think in idea so much as in image. And it's very intuitive. I'm feeling my way along, and it's a balance, because every now and then one comes across an absolute problem that one has to sit down and work out as rigorously as a math problem, you know, and you have to sit at your desk all day, and at the end of the day, maybe you have nothing and you ball it all up and it's your day's work. So it's a real balance between very cold analytical work and things that just come to you when you're out walking or working in the garden or things like that. And it's necessary to have both.
The Little Friend is set in Mississippi, the landscape of Donna Tartt's childhood, and runs to over 500 pages, but is difficult to put down. The compelling narrative of the book hides its intricate structure. Told from various viewpoints, the novel looks back to the shocking and apparently motiveless murder of an infant, and the long shadow that this event casts on the victim's family and friends. Actual writing of Little Friend, which was no mean feat, did you ever think it was going to be such a big novel? Did you start out with the idea that it was going to be a very big novel?
Well, I never start anything out with the idea that it's going to be a big novel. It just sort of seems to happen that way.
You talked about setting yourself a challenge with a little friend. What was that challenge?
Well, I wanted to try to do some things technically that I had not done before. I wanted to write in authorial omniscient. It's much more challenging to write from the point of view of many characters than from one. The secret history was told through one voice, was seen through a single pair of eyes. There are many voices in this novel, many different viewpoints. It's a much broader social canvas than The Secret History. And the language and the diction are completely different from The Secret History. It was a different vocabulary, even.
And there's a very, very scary part of The Little Friend, which again relates to that fear where Harriet is underwater in the water tank, you know, fighting for her life, but also to make sure that someone else doesn't kill her, as she thinks is going to happen. Did that come from a fear that you could relate to?
I almost drowned when I was 6 years old. I almost drowned in a hotel swimming pool. I remember it very, very, very clearly. A stranger saved me. Some man I've never seen again. He realized I was drowning and pulled me out of the water.
There was nobody to talk to, and nothing to do, and no place to go but the pool. Every day at 1 o'clock, Harriet put her towel under her arm and walked over. For long, dreamy spells, she lay in a dead man's float, staring down at her own shadow. Towards this, at least, Harriet had progressed over the summer. She could hold her breath comfortably for well over a minute, and, if she stayed very still, she could grit it out, not so comfortably, for nearly 2. Her ears buzzed. She could almost feel the sun beating hot across her back as she soared above ashy plains, vast desolations. I know what it feels like to die. If she opened her eyes, it would be to her own shadow, arms spread, a Christmas angel, shimmering blue on the floor of the swimming pool.
The longest 3 seconds of my life were when I was 14 and I was a passenger in an automobile wreck, and I saw the car coming toward us. I saw it, and it just seemed like it went on for about 2 months. You know, just the car coming, the car coming. Time gets very funny in those sorts of situations, and then bam, the impact. I don't know what it is, but I think it's a fact of perception that our senses slow down, and we often, right before an accident or something like that, remember everything very, very, very clearly.
The environment itself is a character in the book.
I know the layouts of, several Mississippi towns very well, and in order to keep from confusing my fictional town with the real towns, I had to draw a map and keep really referring back to it constantly as I was writing the book.
This is the Mississippi, which is vaguely related to your childhood.
Well, I think it was Faulkner who said that all educated Mississippians have 2 distinct voices. They have the school voice, they have the educated voice, and then they have the nursery voice, the baby voice, the tongue they heard when they were small, and I do have both. I think also part of being a good writer is being a good mimic. Mimicry also being a gift that runs in my family. There's some very wicked mimics. It's sort of a family trait.
Including you, obviously.
I'm not the worst, but...
Or the best.
Or the best, should we say. I'm not the cruelest.
Harriet, tell me about Harriet, though, because at once she's vulnerable, she's feisty, and she's incredibly bookish as well.
I was a girl who loved books for boys, really. I was very bored by Little Women and things like that. I loved Treasure Island, and I loved The Jungle Book, and I loved Kim, and I loved Arthur Conan Doyle. And it seemed to me that little girls have their own particular characteristics that would make them just as good in an adventure story as little boys. Because little girls are crafty, and they know how to hold their cards, and they hold a grudge, and they're very jealous. And they have very distinct qualities that would actually make them work well in an adventure story. But it seemed to me very interesting to try to write an adventure story from the point of view of a girl, particularly a bookish little girl.
In every book, I suppose, there has to be elements of different people's experiences, but I mean, is Harriet a bit autobiographical?
Harriet is a bit autobiographical in a family sense. It's more about how family traits can echo and reverberate and come back differently within a family, really. That's more what I was thinking about when I was writing Harriet than really anything autobiographical.
From the time she was old enough to talk, Harriet had been a slightly distressing presence in the Cleve household. Fierce on the playground, rude to company, she argued with Edie and checked out library books about Genghis Khan and gave her mother headaches. She was 12 years old and in the 7th grade. Though she was an A student, the teachers had never known how to handle her. Harriet was not disobedient, exactly, or unruly, but she was haughty and somehow managed to irritate nearly every adult with whom she came in contact. She was sturdily built, like a small badger, with round cheeks, a sharp nose, black hair bobbed short, a thin, determined little mouth. She spoke briskly, in a reedy, high-pitched voice that for a Mississippi child was oddly clipped, so that strangers often asked where on earth she had picked up that Yankee accent.
The Little Friend was a different approach to storytelling, really, I think, than The Secret History, because I was thinking more about how a single event can reverberate in time through a family.
Edie, 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 Edie. He was 9 years old, but it was a family joke now, his traditional greeting, and he sang it out across the yard just as he always did, as she stepped out upon the porch on that last afternoon she ever saw him. "Come give me a kiss," she called to him. But though he usually liked having his picture made, sometimes he was skittish about it, and when he saw the camera around Edie's neck, he was off and hiccuping with laughter. "Come back to me, you scamp," she called. And then, on impulse, she'd raised the camera and snapped it at him anyway. It was the last picture of him they had.
Harriet's brother is murdered, and the prologue of the book is actually not about the murder itself. So the book opens 12 years later after
Robin has been hanged.
After Robin has been hanged, and Robin's little sister is grown up now, who was a baby when it happened, and she's now 12. It's an incredible challenge to write from the point of view of a child, and I had 2 children in this book to write from.
Harriet, of course, is accompanied by Healy, who is a boy that's certainly in her thrall as well. They have a very interesting relationship, and she's definitely the dominant of the 2.
Though Healy had ridden his bicycle all over the neighborhood that morning, Harriet was nowhere to be found. At her house, the strange atmosphere, strange even for Harriet's, was worrying. It gave him the chills. What excited him was a dangerous criminal on the loose and the notion of being a hero. Though he was grateful to have evaded church camp, the summer so far had been just a little too quiet. Apprehending a killer promised to be more fun than acting in pageants or running away from home or any of the other activities he'd hoped to do with Harriet over the summer. When he saw her in the distance, he took off. Pedaling furiously, she soon caught up with him. The street lamps were not yet lit. The air smelled like hedge clippings and bug spray and honeysuckle. "It's about to rain," said Harriet. "So what?" said Healy. He felt invincible, ranking officer, conqueror of the planet.
You create a world where the children kind of live in a parallel universe. They have their separate lives.
Oh, I think children do have their separate lives. Children are their own little tribe. They're very different from adults. They band together. They have to lie in order to get what they want. They're in league against the adults. They have no economic power whatsoever. They're completely at the mercy of their parents, often at their parents' whim. And in order to be able to do what they want to, they have to tell stories.
And at the heart of this book are secrets and stories and truth and falsehoods as well. I mean,
yes.
And children misremember things, and you're very good at...
Or they don't always understand things. They hear things very clearly, but they don't always understand or know how to interpret those things.
And that's at the heart of this book.
They don't have the experience yet. Children perceive things very clearly, but they don't always understand what they see. And more than anything, they don't understand their own emotional reactions and the way that their own emotions color things that they see. They don't understand that the things they see are colored so ferociously by their own feelings. And that's something we don't understand until much later.
At the heart of this book, there's fear as well, because it's a book essentially about children, but not for children, I think you might say. Though I think children would love it, actually.
They might like it, but I don't know if they should be permitted to read it.
Really? Because it's too scary?
Maybe. I don't know. I can't imagine. I can imagine it being a book that I would read when I was a child, but not. I can't imagine it being a book that would be given to me.
This grown-up novel, from a child's point of view, is set very specifically in the American South of the early 1970s, where and when Tartt herself was raised.
The 70s were a very interesting time in Mississippi because it was after the upheavals of the 1960s, which were intensely violent. I remember very well when Martin Luther King was shot, for instance. And so much change happened so fast, and everyone was trying to figure out, what do we do now? Because things had been unchanged in the American South since well before the Civil War. When I was a little girl, of course, it was no longer segregated, but there were, as in boys and girls school that have in stone boys on one side, girls on the other, the doctor's office I used to go to, it had white on one side, colored on the other. Everything had changed. I mean, it's incredible the change I've seen in my lifetime.
Harriet's maid, Ida Rue, who she's incredibly close to and feels the smell of her, smells her, everything about her, it gives her security. She doesn't even drink out the same cup as the rest of the family.
This is exactly what I'm talking about. People are still trying to, I mean, those are still old ways that are horrible remnants that are still left over. Change doesn't happen overnight.
You'd be classed in some ways as a kind of Southern writer, but do you think of yourself as quite a writer looking in on the South from beyond it?
Well, culturally, I feel a great affinity with the Southern writers. However, they weren't great influences on my actual development as a writer. I didn't read a lot of Southern writers when I was growing up and when I basically was becoming a writer. And I think that's for all sorts of reasons. One of the reasons is that I loved the 19th century so much, and the great Southern novels weren't really written until the 20th century. The great exception is Poe, who I adore. Of course, I love Mark Twain, but he was really from a border state. He wasn't exactly a Southerner. And I think that also part of the reason is that when I was a child and reading, it really made me want to become a writer. I think reading for me, as it is for most children, was about escape. I would much rather be in a pirate ship with Jim Hawkins than I would be, you know, sort of going down a sidewalk in Georgia with Carson McCullers. Or so. Do you know what I'm saying? It's about the different. It's about what you don't know. It's about going other places. So I really only came to know the Southern writers as an adult, after I was fully formed, really, in what I did. I learned my craft from novels of the 19th century, English and Russian and French.
Treasure Island is a thread that pops up now and then through the book. Was it a touchstone when you were writing The Little Friend?
Treasure Island is one of those books that I've read so often that it's more inside me now than out. It just is, I've really internalized it in some strange way, like the people at the end of Fahrenheit 451. It's a book that I really love.
You're very good at describing the whole sense of the kind of almost cloying heat of the South and the tuberose. And is it important to you to give the reader as much to work on as rather than leaving it in their head to work out?
Well, the thing about growing up in the South is that one is continually assaulted, and not always in ways that one likes, by the environment. As a child, you run on the pavement, your feet are burned, you're stung by mosquitoes. There are terrible smells, there are wonderful smells. It's hot, it's blisteringly hot. When you step outside, it just falls on you like a hot towel.
The house, amusingly, had been called Tribulation. Judge Cleave's grandfather had named it that because he claimed the building of it had very nearly killed him. Nothing remained of it but the twin chimneys and the mossy brick walk. The bricks worked in a tricky herringbone pattern, leading from the foundation down to the front steps, where 5 cracked tiles on the riser, in faded Delft blue, spelled the letters C-L-E-V-E. To Harriet, these 5 Dutch tiles were a fascinating relic of a lost civilization. To her, their fine, watery blue was the blue of wealth, of memory, of Europe, of heaven. And the tribulation she deduced from them glowed with the phosphorescence and splendor of dream itself.
You create interior space very well, and you give it a tremendous character. Do you enjoy writing about interior spaces where the characters inhabit? Is that one of your joys?
Well, I think that to write well about interior spaces is to write about the characters that live in them. Dickens is the great example of that. I think of the description of Mr. Tulkinghorn's apartments in Bleak House. You know, like as he is to look at his apartment at the present date, rusty, obsolete, you know, and there's a wonderful description of his rooms, you know, which were musty old lawyer's rooms, which exactly correspond to the rusty old lawyer. Describing rooms is another way of characterization, inanimate objects. I think in Chekhov there's a I can't remember what story, but there's a wonderful canoe that I think tips over later on in the story, but it's gliding by with a crafty look on its face. You know it's going to cause some trouble later on in the story.
You've got an extraordinary knack of remembering passages. I mean, it's a kind of amazing. I mean, apparently you can recite all of the Wasteland. Is that really true?
Yeah.
Does it give you comfort that you can think about these things and go back to them? It's
very nice to be bored in line at the supermarket and to be able to entertain myself.
It sounds like a Woody Allen film. Getting from the idea to the written word, how's your process? How do you actually do that?
Well, I'm a writer who has to read everything aloud as I'm working. I'm constantly reading aloud to myself. It's very funny when I have workmen in the house, I'm very self-conscious because I know they go past my room and it sounds like 3 or 4 people are having an argument in there. So yes, it's very important to me the way that it sounds, and I was read aloud to from the time I was a child, and I think being read aloud to is part of the reason that I'm a writer. My relationship is not just to words on the page, but it is to spoken word is very important to me.
And so when The Little Friend was finally finished and with the publisher, what was the feeling like this time?
Well, I was already working on something else. So that's all I was thinking about.
Donna Tartt, thank you very much indeed.